power sector is dead. Don't mean that. That's why I added not really. It wasn't there at first. But this is about transformation in the power sector and what it means to coal in particular. And it puts me in mind of the conversations I had last night a little bit. I met an old friend last night that I hadn't seen in 30 years, Jerry Oliver. And we caught up on how, and Jerry was also, incidentally, the cool part of that story is that Jerry was my first boss in this business when I went to work at a mine in the Powder River Basin in the late 70s. And the reason that I bring that up is because at that time, we were working at a uranium mine. The Powder River Basin didn't have a coal mine. It was a uranium mining basin. And that's what was being mined, and then later it became, of course, a coal basin. So transformation can happen quickly. It can also happen over a long period of time. And a little bit of both of those things are going on now in the power industry. So maybe it's time to move forward here. Okay, so what do I mean when I say the power sector is dead? It's not dead, of course. What it is DEAD, where each of those letters stands for something that's going on. The first is decarbonization. It's very clear that that's a key factor in how the industry is transforming right now, both the coal industry, especially the coal industry, and the power industry as well. The E stands for what happens when you electrify vehicles. This is a longer-term kind of thing, not something that's happening right now. Our view, and I'll show you some slides later, our view is that it's really about 20 years before you see this have material impact on the power sector. But once it does get underway, it's going to involve some significant change for the power sector and for the grid. The A stands for access to energy. Again, this is probably not so much a factor for the U.S. power industry. Pretty much everybody in this country has access to reliable power. But it is a factor around the world, especially in parts of Asia and in India and in Africa. Hundreds of millions, well, probably between 1 and 2 billion people in the world do not have access to reliable electricity. And then the discussion then becomes, how do you provide that access to them? And the answer is it could be one of many things. It could be an extension of an existing grid, if there is one there. Or it could be something more decentralized that involves distributed energy resources and microgrids or some versions of that and localized power grids. So that's the second D. And the power sector worldwide, and even here in the U.S., with respect to some of these initials, is in transformation to meet these forces. So let's take a look, and most of my comments I'll confine really to decarbonization here, because that's the thing that matters the most, I think, to coal right here. Obviously, and we'll put a chart up here, we do see continued growth in electricity sales into the future. That's driven by some basic fundamentals such as population growth. So here you're seeing our forecast of population growth, modest growth going into the future, 0.7% per annum growth in population. More people mean more energy means more electricity means, used to mean a lot more coal. Means less coal now, but it still means coal. But there are also, and there are other factors that push the need for more electricity. But just to keep the chart fairly simple, there are also factors occurring that are negative for the use of for energy. And it was mentioned in the first keynote today, and that's the impact of improving technology on the intensity of coal. Or the intensity of electricity. So it just simply takes, I guess you could look at this as elasticity. It simply takes less electricity now to produce or be associated with 1 unit of GDP. Less and less and less. So you have the combination of those factors. You have more people, they need more energy, they need more electricity, but this is a system that gets by with less. And your economy matters. Is it primarily services-led or is it industrial-led? These things matter. When you look at it and put it together on a per capita basis, you can see that there was a change that occurred in about 2006 or so. Up until then, the per capita use of electricity was growing. After that, it began to decline. So we look at 2006 as a tipping point. And what were the factors that helped create that tipping point? Well, between 2006 and a few years after, we had the global recession, which really knocked the heck out of electricity consumption for a short period, well, for a period of time. We also had a commodity bust. An example would be the aluminum industry, which is a big consumer of electricity. Got hurt really bad in the commodity bust. And so electricity sales plummeted as a result of that. But the biggest factor was probably just the simple light bulb. And it's an example of how technology can matter and how policy can intersect with that technology to make a difference. Lighting was probably 15% of electricity demand. And when we moved away from incandescent lighting, we became 80% more efficient in lighting and how much electricity is needed for lighting. And that's a big portion of what's going on in that decline in per capita and electricity consumption. But we think we're at another tipping point right now. The per capita consumption of electricity, we think, will stabilize now. And in sort of it's not a plateau, it's a valley, but it's a flat valley going forward. We think that what's been able to be gathered in efficiency out of lighting, for example, has already been done. And it's pretty expensive to get the other kinds of efficiencies that we're talking about. So barring technological breakthroughs, which are really important and can make a difference, we don't see much change in per capita electricity consumption going forward. So what does that mean in terms of the actual capacity that is planned to produce that electricity and the share of that capacity versus other fuels? So here, a simple chart. This will be capacity with gigawatts on the left side and share in percentage on the right side. This is our estimate of coal capacity change by year going forward. And you can see that the vertical line in the middle represents today. So you can see the decline that's already begun in coal-fired capacity reductions in the U.S. Started late in middle of the last decade. And going forward, you can see that that's going to continue. I think when you sum this up, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think our view is something like 160, 165 gigawatts of coal capacity reduction over the next 20 years. At the same time, we had the gas build-out. Now, this starts in 2000. Obviously, the gas capacity build-out started before that. But you can see it was substantial in the early part of the new century. And today, new gas-fired capacity is approximately, in our view, going to be equal to coal-fired capacity that gets retired going forward. Some minor changes with nuclear and hydro, not minor to those industries, but in the scheme of things with respect to this chart, kind of a minor change. And then we can talk about wind. Obviously, this is, the things like wind in the beginning anyway were the confluence of economic and technical and environmental factors. And environmental factors have two paths, right? There's this sort of the pure environment considerations, and then there's the political side of environmental science. And the confluence of all of those factors created an opportunity, and with policy, created an opportunity to develop wind. And we see the capacity adds there, and by the time you get to 2035 or so, you'll have a wind capacity in the U.S. that's approximately equal to the coal-fired capacity at that time. Solar is a late bloomer, but the same thing's going to happen with solar. Eventually, it's going to reach the size of we think around the mid-2030s, about the size of in gigawatt terms of the coal fleet. So you'll have wind and solar and coal, and then you'll have gas as the transition fuel, which is still growing. Tipping point. Speaking of tipping points roughly now, but starting, say, last year, the additions to capacity have been declining since about 2001. But we think that's reversing now and is going to continue to reverse. And that makes sense if you think about it, because your gas is sort of replacing coal, but you're growing with power. You have more people, you need more power. And if you're adding a wind and solar fleet to that, you're going to have more capacity because they obviously can't run at the capacity factors that fossil fuels can. So those lines just represent the share for the fossil and non-fossil sections. Let's look at this in capacity share of just the non-fossil section of the power fleet, which is kind of interesting. If you look at this, this is hydro and nuclear. There's not a lot of capacity change going on there, but their share of the non-fossil segment of capacity is falling from over 80% in the year 2000 to only, like 20% or so in the mid-2030s. And that's because, of course, the build-out in wind and solar become very strong. So even though the capacity isn't changing much, the growth in the non-fossil sector is making them less and less important. If we convert that capacity to generation, then the story is one that I'm sure you all understand. Generation for coal is going to decline going forward. Gas sort of makes up the difference. That's nuclear. And there we are with hydro and wind and solar on the top. So what does all this mean? Again, the lines are just shares. What does all this mean for carbon emissions in the U.S.? So it is a story, it was mentioned earlier. I think Dan mentioned it. It's a story that we should be proud of in the country. It's quite an accomplishment. CO2 emissions in the power sector have declined from coal. They're about 60-some% now of what they were in the year 2000, and by 2035 or so, they'll be only a third of what they were at that time. So that's quite an accomplishment. Or it would be anyway if it weren't on the back basically of one industry, and that's the coal industry. Most of this accomplishment has been borne by policy and other factors that affected the coal industry. And there you see, of course, the growth in gas emissions, CO2 emissions from gas, with the growth in generation that just accompanies the growth in generation. But the combined fossil fuel emissions of CO2 is still down, and that's obvious, right? Because gas is less carbon dense than coal. And let me back up one here. If you look at those emissions then on a per capita basis, you can see a pretty significant decline up through today and a continued decline in our view into the future. So what does this mean for coal? Well, it means a coal fleet capacity decline. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, right? That's partly offset by increased coal capacity factors. It's our view that as you start reducing the number of coal plant capacity out there, that you'll be running the remaining plants a little harder. So that partially offsets the capacity decline. It also means that in aggregate, in terms of building plant, not with respect to the kind of investment from a technical side you had made in an existing plant, but just in a coal plant overall, that you're not going to see new coal plants going into the future into the U.S. unless there's some kind of major technological breakthrough or change in policy. And that means the strategies for survival for all elements of the coal value chain are in transition as well. If you're a coal producer, how are you going to survive in an environment like that? For sure, it's going to mean increased competition. You and your neighbors are chasing fewer and fewer market. And that means more competition, at least for a while. And if you're a consumer, it might sound like good news that increased competition is going to lower price for you, and it probably will, until that competition begins to die off. And then you as a consumer are captive to one or two producers who gain pricing power in that situation. So it's not a healthy situation. So how do you survive? You can choose as a coal producer, for example, to be the best at what you do, to lower your cost, to produce the lowest delivered cost to the marketplace. That's a strategy for survival. So is transforming your business into something different, mining a different commodity, or acquiring something different. And a third general strategy might just be harvest of the business. You might look at this situation and say, I'm not going to invest the funds that are required to transition. I'm just going to harvest this business. So those are things that have to be looked at well in advance of actually doing anything. But so much comes down to how the carbon is going to be regulated. You know, is it going to be a performance-driven kind of standard in the future? Will it be regulated by saying you can only emit X tons of CO2? Or will it be an economic or sort of a market-driven approach, a trading scheme like cap and trade was for sulfur dioxide? And if there's a tax, what will that tax look like? And this is a global commodity, right? This is CO2. It knows no national boundaries. So if you don't tax it uniformly across the world, then you'll see shifts in economic production that are related to the costs that capturing or mitigating carbon brings to the global economic scene. So all of these things really matter and point to the need for global cooperation in dealing with the situation. And then carbon capture and use or storage. High cost is obviously a barrier to its use, but it may be essential. I mean, we can think about coal as having two paths to a better future. One would be a dramatic reduction in something like in the cost of something like carbon capture and sequestration. If those costs were greatly lowered, that would then lower a significant portion of coal's externality costs and make it more competitive and give it a better future. But so would a world that says we must meet no more than a 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperatures going forward. That cannot be done without using coal, cannot be done without using coal, and would require significant rollout of carbon capture. Okay, so that's about all I wanted to say about decarbonization, and I'll quickly, Janet, just to get through this in a hurry, I'll quickly look at the other, the E, the A, and the D. The first, electrification, I mentioned that we don't see that as an immediate kind of issue. It might be a little hard to see there, but you can see the line. It begins to accelerate out about 2030. But even in terms of the electricity sales that are required to support electric vehicles, they don't reach 2 or 3% until almost 2040. But at that time, they're growing very rapidly. The chart on the right is peak demand. It's basically the same story. And in terms of what, actually went the wrong way, sorry. So what does that mean in terms of, what does electrification actually mean in terms of the power industry and the coal industry? Increased load, not much increased load right now, but down the road, an increased load. The load profile will obviously change. When is peak load going to occur? Is it going to be 3 to 6 p.m. Like it largely is now? No. It might shift depending on the size of the load from electric vehicles. It might be 6 to 9. It might require load balancing or the kinds of incentives given to electricity users that would encourage them to balance the load a little differently and to charge their cars at a different time of the day. It's going to affect fuel. What fuel is being impacted by the change in peak demand at that time? Is it gas? Is it coal? Is it renewables? I mean, if you're charging your car at night, you're not going to charge it with wind, so you're going to charge it with either gas or coal. All of this will create pricing issues, and we'll have to have some kind of new tariff structure or incentives built around how to handle this new load. But the big thing, I think, reflects the actual distribution of the power in the grid. Neighborhood distribution to our neighborhoods now is not sufficiently robust to handle a large electricity charging load for cars. So what could be, that means that if you can't manage that in a load balancing way, well, how are you going to reinforce that power delivery system to make it work? Becomes a real issue. And what does all this mean for coal? Well, I mean, it's bad for oil, right? It takes the market away from oil, but does it matter to coal? And the answer is, we don't really know. Not yet anyway, because it matters when things get charged. When's the peak? When do things get charged? It matters where they get charged. It may be that electric car growth occurs mostly in green states that are already fairly green, like California. That has less impact on coal than it would if it happened in a coal-intensive state. And it matters for duration. Are these cars going to be charged with fast-charging DC? Are they going to be charged? They're sort of the conventional way at home. All those things matter. My view, and it's just a guess, is that this is likely over time to be a small net positive for coal, just because coal remains a piece of the generation picture and generation is growing. Access. Access is a global phenomenon, really. What we really mean there is how do we provide reliable power to the hundreds of millions of people, actually more than 1 billion people who need it. Technical solutions, obviously, are one way to do that. You can extend the grid, the traditional, keep a centralized power system, or you can go to something different, distributed energy resources in local power grids or microgrids of some kind. This all would require changes in policy solutions. But in the U.S., this is kind of a non-issue, right? We have reliable power. But there might be some cases where, and people are talking about this even today here in the U.S., where you might be able to provide power in small doses without extending the grid in large neighborhood kind of developments, not single neighborhoods, but groups of neighborhoods. There are certain areas of the country that would be happy to build a microgrid, pay more for it, and do that rather than extend the grid at the cost that involves. What does that mean for coal? Well, really it just means it's a location-dependent kind of thing. If you're in India or Asia, you obviously, and you provide coal, or you're in the US and you provide coal to India or Asia, this is a large net positive for coal because they're not backing away from coal at the pace with which the developed nations are. They are beginning to back away from it, especially in China, not so much in India, but not at the pace that we're seeing in the developed world. In general, I think we could say that anything we do to provide power without extending the grid is a net negative for coal, because no one's going to put in a micro grid and power it with a coal plant. They're going to use solar or wind and back it up with gas. And then in terms of distribution, decentralization, and here we're talking about the transition to a localized network of distributed energy resources. So really goes hand in hand with access. An example, I mean, we're familiar with distributed generation and microgrids. These are examples of a decentralized approach. The advantages, in my mind, to a simple view of the advantages is it minimizes the transmission costs. if you do something like that. And people talk about resilience, and I agree, we had a comment earlier, what does resilience mean? It means a lot of different things to different people, but to me it means the ability to withstand a shock to the entire system. So almost by definition, a microgrid is more resilient than a centralized grid if it incurs one of those major shocks. But the problem is it's really expensive, and the costs are still high. It needs new grid hardware. It needs new grid software. All of that has to be managed, and all that has to be regulated. And there'll be a lot of change in the regulatory system to accomplish this. So the emphasis will be, I think, on this, if you're in the renewable space, on, pardon me, further technology development in order to get those costs down even further. Minimal impact, I think, with respect to coal for this D, for decentralization, maybe a very small net negative at most. So last slide, Janet. What does it really mean? What do we mean when we say we have a dead power sector? If you're in the developed world, it means you're concerned about decarbonization and what impact that's going to have on the production of power and what impact that's going to have on the selling of coal into your marketplace. If you're in the developing world, it has all to do with access. How am I going to get my electricity? And is that going to come from coal, or is that going to come from something else? And will it be provided in a centralized grid, or will it be provided in a decentralized power system? So again, the power system is decarbonizing, a smaller coal fleet running harder, but requiring less coal. It's preparing to provide electricity to electric vehicles in the long term, which has a small net positive impact in the U.S. for coal. It's preparing to provide access to the billions of people that need it around the world, and it may be, in certain parts of the world, decentralizing into a flexible grid system with distributed energy resources.